In the blood-drenched corridors of medieval French castles, beneath banners bearing sacred crosses and beside altars meant for worship, a monster walked in silk and armor, the Jeffrey Epstein of medieval France. This nobleman's crimes, which even more twisted, is not merely a tale of aristocratic decadence. It is a descent into the blackened heart of one of history's most disturbing figures, Gilles Race. This was a man who once stood beside Joan of Arc on the battlefield, only to later become the architect of a nightmare that would horrify even the most hardened inquisitor. His story unfolds not in a brothel or royal court, but in hidden chambers and forested manors, where innocence vanished and silence was bought with blood. It is a chronicle of power unbound by consequence, of a man who turned wealth and status into instruments of sadistic pleasure, leaving behind a trail of vanished children, horrified servants, and corrupted priests. To compare Gilles de Rais to Jeffrey Epstein is not hyperbole, is historical echo. Both men moved through elite circles, masked their crimes with influence, and turned human lives into disposable offerings for their obsessions. But where Epstein trafficked in hidden islands and political favors, Gilles bathed his crimes in ritual and myth, transforming the act of murder into a dark liturgy. His tale is not one of madness alone, but of society's complicity of nobles who looked away, clergy who accepted gold, and a kingdom too fractured to care. This is the story of how evil can wear the robes of chivalry, speak the language of piety, and still drag the innocent into its tomb. In the year 1405, as France bled from the endless wounds of the 100 Years' War, a child was born into one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in the kingdom, Gilles de Montmorency-Laval, later known as Gilles de Rais. His birth brought no ominous signs, no trembling stars, no wild prophecy. Instead, it brought expectation, heir to ancient bloodlines and oceans of land. Gilles entered the world not as a common child, but as a vessel through which generations of noble ambition and knightly valor were meant to endure. The Laval family's lineage was as storied as it was proud, descending from the high nobility of Brittany and Anjou. They held vast estates, commanded loyalty from lesser lords, and could trace their claims through centuries of entanglements in feudal hierarchies. The boy's father, Guy de Laval, was a hardened warrior with a reputation for valor, while his mother, Marie de Crone, came from a house equally formidable in blood and property. Their union, though more alliance than affection, placed Guy at the center of a rare convergence of power. Yet whatever hopes were pinned to the boy unraveled early. When Gilles was around 10 years old, tragedy shattered the household. His father died in a hunting accident, gored, some claimed, by a wild boar, though others whispered darker rumors. His mother followed not long after, leaving Gilles and his younger brother, René, as orphans. The pair were placed under the guardianship of their maternal grandfather, Jean de Crone, a cunning, domineering man whose affections lay not in the hearts of his grandchildren but in their inheritance. It was Jean de Crone who began to shape the future Gilles. More merchant than knight, more schemer than sage, Jean saw his grandson less as a boy to be raised and more as a political asset to be positioned. The old man had little interest in the ideals of chivalry, though he recognized how useful they could be. Gilles, he decided, would not merely inherit land, he would be molded into a living symbol of aristocratic might, the very image of wealth, learning, and military glory. With that vision, the boy's education began. The tutor's crown assembled were the finest that silver and status could buy. Gilles learned Latin and church doctrine from Benedictine monks who believed that the boy's soul, if rightly guided, could become a beacon of Christian virtue. He was drilled in logic and rhetoric, in philosophy and the histories of Rome and Greece. He absorbed military strategy as he might have memorized prayers devoutly, if not yet with conviction. By the time he was a teenager, he could quote Aristotle, Argiakinus, and compose letters that glittered with feudal pride. But the learning was brittle, more mask than substance, and beneath it all, a subtle rot had begun to take hold. Giller had grown up surrounded by opulence so suffocating that no desire seemed out of reach. His estates, already vast, were expanding through careful marriage negotiations orchestrated by his grandfather. And here, Jean de Crown's manipulations were most apparent. In 1420, when Gilles was only 15, Crown arranged for him to marry Catherine de Four's heiress to the barony of La Vendée. Though still a child, Catherine brought with her considerable lands and wealth, further solidifying Gilles' position. The marriage was one of paper and profit, not sentiment, and Gilles' role in it was more pawn than groom. But the union made him, by his mid-teens, one of the richest nobles in France. By that time, the war that had gutted France for generations still raged with no end in sight. The English, emboldened by their alliance with the Burgundians, continued their brutal campaign across the north. Whole provinces were reduced to ash. Nobles turned brigand. The authority of the French crown had grown so weak that even minor lords acted with impunity. It was within this world fractured, lawless, and drunk on blood that Giller would come of age. With lands stretching from Brittany to Poitou, Giller had the resources to live as he pleased. What separated him from other young nobles, however, was not merely his fortune, but the peculiar insulation that fortune afforded him. Gilles's household became a court in miniature, lavish, theatrical, indulgent. His servants numbered in the hundreds, his stables housed some of the finest war horses in France, and his clothes were embroidered with gold thread. At tournaments, he spared no expense, wearing capes of peacock feathers and silks imported from Italy. He rode into battle dressed more like a myth than a man, but wealth alone did not satisfy him. Gilles was drawn, even early on, to theatricality, to the art of spectacle, and to the seduction of control. He began to stage elaborate entertainments at his chateau festivals that blurred the lines between religious ritual, military pomp, and dramatic performance. These were not simple feasts. They were immersive worlds, complete with hired actors, heraldic displays, and sermons composed for effect. In the eyes of his guests, Gilles was not just a host, he was a figure of awe, of overwhelming presence. This desire to dominate not merely through violence, but through attention, would fester in more grotesque ways as he matured, even in his youth. Some sensed that his indulgences were excessive, but none dared reprimand him. His reputation as a warrior was already growing. In 1427, barely out of adolescence, Gilles began to distinguish himself on the battlefield. His wealth allowed him to outfit a private army, and he rode with distinction in campaigns against the English. The chaos of the 100 Years' War provided him not only with opportunity, but with cover. In a world gone mad with slaughter, Gilles' violence seemed noble, his extravagance forgivable. It was during these campaigns that Gilles first encountered Joan of Arc, the peasant girl from Domremy, whose visions had turned the tide of the war. At her side, Gilles found both purpose and a new stage upon which to project his identity. Appointed as one of her personal captains, he was with her during the relief of Orleans in 1429, a victory so improbable that it seemed divine. Though their relationship remains difficult to define, it is clear that Gilles saw in Joan something that both fascinated and unsettled him. Her purity of vision, her refusal to be corrupted by the world he had mastered, cast a strange light upon him. For a time, he stood in that light. Following Joan's victories, Gilla was elevated to the rank of Marshal of France, one of the highest military honors in the kingdom. He was barely 24. With this title came further prestige, and with it, even less accountability. Now Gilles no longer had to play the part of the aspiring noble. He had become a symbol of chivalric France reborn, despite the war's ravages. In the year 1405, as France bled from the endless wounds of the 100 Years' War, a child was born into one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in the kingdom. Gilles de Montmorency-Laval, later known as Gilles de Race, his birth brought no ominous signs, no trembling stars, no wild prophecy. Instead, it brought expectation, heir to ancient bloodlines and oceans of land. Gilles entered the world not as a common child, but as a vessel through which generations of noble ambition and knightly valor were meant to endure. The Laval family's lineage was as storied as it was proud. Descending from the high nobility of Brittany and Anjou, they held vast estates, commanded loyalty from lesser lords, and could trace their claims through centuries of entanglements in feudal hierarchies. The boy's father, Guy de Laval, was a hardened warrior with a reputation for valor, while his mother, Marie de Crone, came from a house equally formidable in blood and property. Their union, though more alliance than affection, placed Guy at the center of a rare convergence of power. Yet whatever hopes were pinned to the boy unraveled early. When Gilles was around 10 years old, tragedy shattered the household. His father died. When Gilles de Rays first rode to war under the banner of King Charles VII, his name was already spoken in elite circles with admiration and envy. His inherited lands, immense wealth, and theatrical persona had made him a curiosity at court. But it was the battlefield that first offered him the chance to transcend the shallow spectacle of noble life and embody the role of a true warrior. He entered the military theater not merely as a young lord, but as a man visibly intoxicated by the pageantry of war. Still, he would need more than costume to earn the trust of generals, and it was not long before his actions began to justify the grandeur of his appearance. By 1427, the French war effort was splintered and despondent. The English had captured key territories and allied themselves with the powerful Burgundian faction. The legitimacy of Charles VII, known derisively as the King of Bourges due to his limited reach, was in doubt. Into this bleak political and military climate stepped an unlikely force of inspiration, a teenage peasant girl from Lorraine, who claimed to have received visions from saints, commanding her to crown the king and drive out the English. Joan of Arc's arrival at court in 1429 was met with skepticism, but the desperation of the moment opened doors. She would not only meet Charles, she would lead his army. Gilles de Rays was among those selected to accompany Joan on her earliest campaigns. His appointment was not incidental. Charles VII, cautious yet curious, knew that surrounding Joan with men of noble birth and military experience would lend her efforts a sense of legitimacy. Gilles, already proven in smaller skirmishes and lavishly armed, was a politically useful figure, but there is little to suggest he was merely a puppet. He appears to have taken a genuine interest in Joan's cause, or, at the very least, in Joan herself. He was present at the siege of Orleans, the turning point in the war, and the moment when Joan's myth was forged. English troops had occupied the city for months, and French morale was at a nadir. Joan entered the city in April 1429, not cloaked in caution, but draped in white armor and mounted on a black horse. Bearing her banner of Jesus and Mary, Gilla rode among her captains, commanding men and drawing attention both for his imposing presence and his disciplined command. The battle, which could have ended in humiliation, instead concluded in a miraculous French victory. Joan's star rose instantly, and Guild was lifted alongside it. Reports from the time describe his bravery during the battle, though some suggest that Guild, ever theatrical, made a point of being visible in moments of crisis. He was often seen near Joan, both as protector and participant in the aura of sanctity that surrounded her. For a time, it seemed as though he believed in her divine mission, or perhaps wished to believe in it. The notion of sacred violence, of war waged by heavenly command, aligned easily with his taste for grandeur and excess. Joan was not merely a general, she was a symbol, and Gilla had always understood the power of symbols. Their campaigns continued. Through the Loire Valley, at Patay Gil again distinguished himself in battle, helping to rout the English forces and clearing the path for Charles VII's coronation. When the king was crowned in Rheims Cathedral that July, Joan stood by his side, radiant in her armor. Gil was named Marshal of France, a title that recognized his contributions and placed him among the highest military commanders in the realm. It was a crowning of sorts for him, as well a moment when his service seemed blessed not only by the crown but by heaven itself. But the glow of Joan's victories would not last. By 1430, political currents had shifted. Joan was captured outside Compiègne by the Burgundians and handed over to the English. Charles, having secured his coronation, distanced himself. Many of Joan's former allies disappeared into silence. Gilla too appears to have withdrawn from active military duty not long after her capture. Whether this was due to political caution, personal grief, or something more complex is unknown. What is clear is that the girl who had once commanded armies in his company would soon be tried and condemned by a church court. Her visions would be called heresies, her armor a mockery, her voice silenced at the stake. Joan's execution in May 1431 was a spectacle both public and devastating. She was burned alive in Rouen at the age of 19, and her ashes were scattered into the Seine so no relic could remain. France did not weep openly. Charles VII made no protest. Gilla, by now far from the political center, said nothing publicly. And yet something shifted. There are no surviving letters, no declarations, no journal entries to tell us what Gilles thought of Joan's fate. But those who would later investigate his crimes, those who would pick through the ashes of his life in search of cause and meaning, often pointed to this moment as a turning point. Some speculated that Joan's death and the cowardice of those who abandoned her shattered whatever vestiges of piety Guild once held. Others believed that his proximity to sanctity and the betrayal of it left a spiritual void he never filled. The truth is unknowable, but the timing is telling. It is after Joan's death that Gilles turned inward, withdrawing from court, from war, from the visible structures of honor. And it is after Joan's death that the whispers around his name began to grow. For several years following his military service, Gil lived not as a soldier, but as a feudal lord unburdened by oversight. His estates became his universe. He withdrew into his castles, particularly the Château d'État fortresses and Machecal fortresses that would later gain infamy. With no wars to fight and no king to impress, he began to channel his resources into pursuits far stranger than knightly honor. He commissioned elaborate theatrical works, often religious in theme, performed with expensive sets and professional actors. The centerpiece was La Mista de la Passion, a massive morality play that required hundreds of participants and was staged with an obsessive level of detail. Giller not only funded these productions, he oversaw them personally. Rehearsals could last for weeks, costumes tailored to an exacting standard, scenes repeated again and again until his vision was satisfied. It is tempting to interpret these dramas as attempts to revive something Joan had embodied, the merging of religious zeal with theatrical performance. But there was something else beneath the surface. The plays, though pious in language, often centered on extreme suffering, temptation, and divine punishment. They explored martyrdom not as triumph but as spectacle. And within these works, Giller was always central. He was not merely a patron. He was the orchestrator of suffering, the high priest of illusion. Where Joan had believed in divine purpose, Giller now seemed to believe only in the power of performance. During these years, his spending grew erratic. He began to sell off lands, some of them centuries-old holdings of the Laval family, to finance his lifestyle. He borrowed enormous sums from unscrupulous lenders. He surrounded himself with astrologers, alchemists, and exotic foreigners who promised secrets, philosophers, stones, necromantic rituals, hidden wisdom. The man once crowned Marshal of France had become a recluse, steeped in occultism and grandiosity, and though the world outside his castles still remembered the hero who rode with Joan, those inside his circle began to speak in lowered voices, careful to avoid his wrath. Some historians argue that Giller's descent had no singular cause, that it was the result of unchecked wealth, isolation, and innate pathology. But Joan's death lingers like a ghost in the story. She had been purity, mission, divine affirmation, and she had died abandoned, accused, and destroyed by the very institutions that once praised her. Gil, for all his faults, had witnessed the brutal erasure of someone he had marched beside, perhaps even believed in. It is not unreasonable to wonder whether part of him broke watching it happen, whether he concluded that holiness was a lie and suffering merely a stage. What began as a life performed in the name of God would gradually mutate into one performed for no God at all. By the mid-1430s, Giller de Race had become a mystery even to those closest to him. No longer a soldier, no longer a statesman, he existed in the strange twilight of fading reputation and hidden obsessions. The man France had once celebrated as a savior was now better known for his vanishing fortune and his increasingly strange behavior. But the worst was still to come. Behind the walls of his castles, far from the scrutiny of church or crown, a different kind of drama had begun, one not of martyrdom but of cruelty. Once the drums of war had quieted and the smoke around Joan of Arc's pyre had dissipated, Gilles de Race was left with a silence that neither gold nor title could fill. No longer bound to the urgency of military command or the gravity of courtly expectations, he drifted into a life that still glittered outwardly, but within had begun to hollow. The once radiant Marshal of France retreated from the battlefield, not disgraced, not dismissed, but curiously absent, a man with every tool to lead, yet no longer a cause to serve. It was during these years that Giles began to disappear from the public eye. His estates remained vast, his name still carried weight in noble circles, but he no longer attended court, no longer offered counsel to the king, and no longer rode to war. What emerged in place of the warrior was something altogether more elusive. Patron of strange arts, a host of pageants and rituals whose meanings seemed known only to him. Where once he had been seen beside Joan, now he was glimpsed rarely, almost mythically, behind the high walls of his castles, where he presided over affairs both theatrical and increasingly inscrutable. Among his many properties, the chateau de Forges came to serve as a kind of stage for the new life Gilles had fashioned for himself. Towering above the rural landscape of Poitou, the fortress was more than a stronghold, became a personal theatre, a world insulated from the constraints of royal authority, ecclesiastical oversight, or feudal responsibility. Within its gates, Gilles constructed a universe tailored to his vision, opulent, performative, arcane. What had begun during his military campaigns as a fascination with ceremony and symbolism now evolved into obsession. Gilles began to produce theatrical works of immense scale, drawing on religious themes and hagiographic narratives, but reimagined through his own particular lens. Chief among these was his Mystère de la Passion, a sprawling, multi-day passion play recounting the sufferings of Christ. He spent outrageous sums on the production, commissioning silks from Italy, hiring choirs, recruiting artisans to construct elaborate sets, and personally overseeing the actors' performances. Witnesses described rehearsals in which Gilles, dressed in velvet robes, would interrupt scenes to demand more agony, more blood, more silence at the moment of betrayal. He demanded that every line, every movement, every sound strike with divine precision. It was not enough to simply portray holiness. Gilles seemed determined to orchestrate it, to control its rhythm, its pace, its volume. He spoke often, according to contemporaries, of purification through suffering, of transcendence through performance. But beneath the rhetoric of faith, something else stirred. Observers noted that the plays, though grand in scale and rich in Christian symbolism, often emphasized the grotesque floggings drawn out in agonizing detail, scenes of demonic temptation, exaggerated for horror, characters weeping in cycles that bordered on hysteria. Even in acts of redemption, there was a lingering taste of punishment. And always, at the center, Gilles stood not on stage, but just behind it, watching, directing, consuming. These performances were not limited to the curious or the devout. Gilles extended invitations to local nobles, visiting dignitaries, and even commoners, though most came not for edification but for spectacle. They spoke in hushed tones of the lavish feasts, of the eeriness of the castle grounds, of the way Gilles would sometimes sit silently through the night in candlelit halls, as if waiting for a vision. It became understood that Tiffordges was no ordinary estate. It was a place where the rules of the outside world no longer applied, and where the mind of its master had begun to eclipse every other reality. At the same time, Gilles was cultivating another passion, one older than theatre, and far more dangerous in its implications. He turned increasingly to alchemy and the occult, pursuits that had long hovered on the fringes of aristocratic curiosity, but which, in Gilles's case, soon swallowed the center. It began, innocuously enough, a fascination with ancient texts, experiments with metals, and conversations with itinerant scholars who promised knowledge buried since the fall of Rome. But it escalated quickly. Gilles brought to his studies the same intensity he had once applied to warfare and theatre. He surrounded himself with alchemists and magicians, men whose names would later be recorded not in honor but in infamy, prelati, sill, blanket figures, who fed his hunger for hidden power. The goals were rarely stated aloud, but those closest to him began to understand. Gilles was not simply seeking wisdom, he was seeking transformation. He sought the philosopher's stone, the elixir of life, the secret to endless wealth and, perhaps, the favor of infernal powers. He funded arcane rituals, purchased rare and forbidden books, and even constructed hidden chambers within his castle's rooms reserved for ceremonies, whose precise nature would only be guessed at later by inquisitors and terrified witnesses. There were chants in dead languages, symbols scrawled in blood, sacrifices of animals, and invocations said to summon demons, who could grant him the mastery of matter and flesh. What made these pursuits more disturbing was the fervor with which Gil embraced them not as curiosities, but as necessities. His fortune, once boundless, began to vanish under the weight of these efforts. Lands that had belonged to his ancestors for generations were sold, pawned, or leveraged to fund experiments that yielded nothing. The once glorious coffers of the House of Laval began to dwindle. By the mid-1430s, Gil was deeply in debt, borrowing from local merchants and rival nobles to continue his operations. He did not slow. If anything, he became more desperate, more convinced that the answer was just one ritual away, one ingredient short, one soul removed from success. There were rumors, of course. They always begin in whispers. Servants fleeing in the night, boys disappearing near the castle, clergy declining invitations. But these, in the context of Giles's grandeur, were dismissed or denied. Who would question a Marshal of France? Who would dare accuse the man who had ridden with Joan of Arc, whose family had bled for the crown? Giles's name still cast a long shadow, and many preferred the safety of silence. As his isolation deepened, so too did his belief in his own myth. Gila began to refer to himself in elevated terms, speaking not as a nobleman but as a prophet, an artist, a mystic. He commissioned portraits in which he was depicted as both warrior and sage, cloaked in robes adorned with alchemical sigils. He told stories to his remaining household of visions, of voices guiding his work, of a destiny too sacred for others to comprehend. Even those who had once believed in him began to step back, uncertain whether the man they served still inhabited the same world as they did. Still, Gil remained untouchable at least for a while. The king, now secure in his rule, had little interest in stirring the ashes of past alliances. The Church, though always wary of unorthodox practices, saw no direct threat so long as Gil confined his rituals to his own domains, and the local population, intimidated by both his reputation and the armed retainers who patrolled his lands, had no recourse. So Gilles continued, unchecked and increasingly unmoored, pursuing mysteries that receded the closer he approached, pouring what remained of his wealth into spectacles that could only mask, not mend, the madness that had begun to surface behind his eyes. By the time he was in his early 30s, Gilles de Rais had become something of a living ghost, a man once touched by glory, now drifting in the ruins of his own creation. He had fought for saints, been honored by kings, and hailed by soldiers. Now he ruled over empty halls, where the echoes of sermons and screams were indistinguishable, and where the line between performance and reality had long since vanished. Long after the courts had spoken, after the fires of condemnation had turned his legacy to ash, Gilles de Rais lived on, but not as a man. What remained was not his name, but a shape, a shadow, a story that slithered free from historical fact, and took root in the murky soil of folklore. Over time, that shadow grew teeth. It acquired a blue beard, a forbidden room, and a line of vanished wives. And though few who repeated the tale could remember the Baron of Brittany by name, the echo of his crimes lived on in the fairy tale's bones. The transformation of Gilles de Rais into the mythical figure known as Bluebeard is not traceable to a single origin. It unfolded gradually, whispered across generations, refracted through storytellers who stitched horror into moral instruction. At its core, the tale of Bluebeard tells of a wealthy, mysterious nobleman who marries a succession of young women. He forbids them from entering one particular room in his vast castle. Inevitably, curiosity triumphs. The room is opened, and the wife discovers the mutilated bodies of her predecessors. Bluebeard returns, enraged, intent on murder, but she is saved at the last moment by her brothers. The message, often interpreted as a caution against disobedience, thinly veils a much older anxiety, the terror of power cloaked in charm, of trust betrayed by appetite. Though the details differ, the parallels to Gilles's life are striking. Like Bluebeard, Gill was a man of immense fortune and mystique, known for his remote castles and vanishing guests. The forbidden chamber in the tale mirrors the hidden rooms of Tiffages and Machecal, where unspeakable things were rumoured to unfold, and the young women of the fable may well be a softening of the truth, not brides, but children, not curious, but helpless. What makes the comparison more than coincidence is its persistence across regions where Gilles once held sway. In the provinces of Western France, Poitou, Brittany, and Gironde traditions, long-preserved stories of a nobleman who lured victims with gifts, whose grandeur masked depravity, and whose castle walls, if they could speak, would scream. These tales, passed from hearth to hearth, often blurred the line between fact and fable. Over time, the monstrous baron became archetypal, less a man and more a warning. By the time Charles Perrault published his Histoire aux Contes du Temps Pass in 1697, the myth had calcified into a recognizable form, Bluebeard as he appears. In Perrault's version, is fully detached from Gilles de Rais in name, but not in essence. Perrault, a courtier in the glittering yet morally anxious world of Louis XIV's France, crafted his tales with both entertainment and instruction in mind. His Bluebeard is no supernatural beast, but a man whose wealth, manners, and mystery conceal something savage. It is precisely the duality-civilized veneer masking monstrous desire that mirrors Gilles's transformation in public memory. Still, the passage from man to myth is never clean. Gilles de Rais's real story is tangled in trial records, confessions given under duress, and centuries of ecclesiastical interpretation. The crimes attributed to him, ritual murder, torture, sexual violence against children, almost too grotesque for belief, and yet were confirmed in testimony after testimony, often from those who had nothing to gain by speaking. He confessed, and later retracted, only to confess again. Whether every detail was true or exaggerated remains debated, but the pattern was consistent enough to fuel the machinery of legend, and it is in that machinery that Bluebeard was forged. Folktales, unlike chronicles, do not seek evidence, they seek resonance. They need only enough truth to strike the bone. In Bluebeard's tale, the horror lies not just in the bloodied room, but in the moment when trust collapses into terror. It is that shift from sanctuary to trap that marks the deeper horror beneath both the myth and Gilles's reality. Interestingly, Bluebeard is not the only figure in European folklore to carry such dark resonance. Across the continent, there are similar stories of men who wear the mask of civility and hide corpses in their closets. In German traditions, figures like Der Ritter, mit dem Blutigen, Bart the Knight with the bloody beard haunt isolated castles. In Slavic tales, there are sorcerers who lure children and brides alike to enchanted fortresses where none return. Even the Greek myth of Eros and Psyche with its forbidden room motif, hints at ancient discomforts around curiosity, gender, and hidden violence. What sets Bluebeard apart is the specificity of his cruelty, domestic, repetitive, cloaked. In Ritualland, the ambiguity of his villainy. He is not a troll or an ogre or a beast. He is a man with means, a man with rules, a man who gives permission, then punishes transgression. And in that framing, Bluebeard does more than scare children. He dramatizes the fear that evil is not always visible, that the most dangerous predator is not the stranger in the woods, but the husband, the host, the man who smiles as he hands you a key. This fear, intimate, civilized, insidious, would grow, sharper over time. Later interpretations of Bluebeard would become even darker, more psychological. In the 19th and 20th centuries, writers like Charles Dickens, Angela Carter, and Georges Bataille would all return to the story, reimagining Bluebeard not just as a monster, but as a mirror of male dominance, secrecy, and power. Freud saw in the tale a parable of forbidden knowledge and castration anxiety. Feminist thinkers saw it as a warning against the silent complicity demanded of women in patriarchal structures. And yet, beneath these interpretations, the soil still bears the imprint of Gilliday race, not because the tale is historically accurate, but because it absorbed the atmosphere he left behind, the landscape littered with vanished children, frightened villagers, and grand estates that whispered of horrors too elaborate to name aloud. Gil was not the only monster Europe ever knew, but he may have been one of the first to be both punished and preserved, not through statues or scripture, but through a tale that every child could understand. Even now, the legend endures. Bluebeard lives in storybooks and ballets, in operas and films, in whispered tales told to young listeners who are only half aware that the line between fairy tale and history is thinner than they think. Gilliday race, meanwhile, lingers beneath the surface, not quite forgotten, not fully known, forever caught between the cold finality of his execution and the warm, mutable life of the tale he inspired. It began almost imperceptibly, as the line between hospitality and predation blurred beneath the shadowed archways of Gilliday race's vast holdings. The lands surrounding his many estates had long been a patchwork of exhausted peasant villages, overworked and underfed, where families often had more children than bread. War, famine, and plague had stripped the population of all but desperation. In such places, a noble's offer of assistance was not questioned, it was seized with gratitude. So when word spread that the great baron was in need of young boys, for house service, choir instruction, or even as pages, few dared wonder what lay behind the gilded doors that opened to receive them. The earliest disappearances were small enough to escape alarm. A stable boy never returned from a message Rontamach echo. A young singer borrowed from a village church to perform at one of Giels's extravagant masses was never returned to his parish. These events, when taken in isolation, passed as accidents, natural misfortunes, in a region where death was as common as rain. But as the months passed, faint murmurs began to ripple through the countryside. Mothers who had entrusted their sons to the baron's emissaries received no letters, no pay, no return. Their inquiries were met with silence, or worse, derision. After all, who among the peasantry had the right to demand answers from a marshal of France? It was not uncommon for noble households to take in boys for training or service. Indeed, the entire structure of aristocratic life rested on the grooming of the next generation of servants, soldiers, and scribes. What set Gilles apart was not the taking, it was the secrecy. Unlike other lords, who paraded their young pages or sent them off to other houses to build careers. Gilles's chosen vanished behind the stone walls of his chateau like coins tossed into a deep well. The families were never invited inside. They were not offered follow-up correspondence. The promise was the end of the conversation. And yet, for a time, no one connected the silence with violence. What helped obscure the pattern further was Gilles's reputation as a patron of the arts and faith. His continued staging of lavish mystery plays complete with elaborate costumes, special effects, and imported talent made him appear as a cultured and generous benefactor. He kept priests at his side and filled chapels with Latin chants. To the villagers, he was both distant and divine, the sort of man God might permit to walk above reproach, even when whispers circulated about locked doors, about strange rituals held at night. Few had the courage to interpret them plainly. It was often his agents who did the recruiting. Men loyal to Gilles travelled with letters bearing his seal, sometimes accompanied by clerics or stewards. They would visit fairs, churches, or festivals and identify promising boys, those with clear voices, graceful posture, or handsome features. The story rarely changed. The Baron had seen promise in the boy and wished to offer him opportunity, maybe even education. The agents would flatter the parents, particularly in smaller hamlets where no one had ever seen nobility take notice of their children. In return for their son, they were often given small purses of silver or promised continued protection. Some families even celebrated their luck, believing their child had risen above the filth and toil that defined peasant life. But for those children, the journey ended at one of Gilles's manors, typically Macheco, Tiffages, or Champtus. There, they were taken in by staff who had long grown used to the routine. The boy would be dressed in fine clothing, bathed, fed, and, for a time, treated with an eerie sort of gentleness. The process had the deceptive cadence of hospitality, as if the master of the house was simply playing host to a visiting noble's son. Yet in the silence of stone corridors and behind heavily bolted doors, the nature of their captivity would shift. Once the outer shell of kindness had served its purpose, the children were isolated, stripped of autonomy, and left at the mercy of a man who had long since stopped distinguishing flesh from power. The Inquisition records later revealed harrowing detail, though the testimonies were not always consistent, some due to trauma, others out of fear. But common patterns emerged. The boys were often kept for a few days, sometimes weeks. During that time, Gilles would alternately dote on them and descend into cruelty. Some were subjected to elaborate ritual humiliations, others were drugged or beaten before the final acts of violence. Those who resisted were punished, sometimes by Gilles himself, sometimes by servants who had learned not to ask why the walls had to be scrubbed so often, or why the wells behind the castle seemed deeper each year. What made his methods particularly disturbing was the ceremonial tone that underpinned them. Gilles did not merely kill, he performed. According to confessions extracted under interrogation, he would dress in ornate robes, recite blasphemous versions of Christian prayers, and enact what he believed to be dark alchemical rites. The child was both victim and offering. Whether Gilles truly believed he was conjuring spirits or merely exercising his own perverse hunger is unknown. But either way, the bodies were reduced to silence, burned, dismembered, or hidden in places so carefully chosen that many were never found. Yet for all the horror, the machine of his operation functioned with chilling banality. Servants cleaned, couriers travelled, clerks recorded names that would never reappear. The outer facade remained polished. In some cases, parents returned months later, knocking gently at the gates of the estate, hoping for news. They were turned away by guards, or told their child had run away, fallen ill, or been sent to another town. With no legal standing and no means to press their case, they left with downcast eyes, sometimes believing the lie, other times not, but either way, they disappeared just as surely as their children had. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of this phase in Gilles's descent is how methodical it became. He did not act as a man gripped by momentary madness. Rather, he appeared to have shaped a life around the continuation of these acts. His chateaux were transformed into traps, luxurious on the outside but rotting within. The normal rhythms of a state, life supply deliveries, religious ceremonies, financial transactions continued in parallel to the quiet industry of death. And as his resources began to dwindle under the weight of his excesses, so too did his reliance on secrecy tighten, forcing him to conceal more behind less. At first, the network of complicity was limited just a few trusted men, perhaps bound by fear or shared depravity. But over time, more people became aware, if only vaguely, that something terrible was unfolding. A page might notice strange stains on the floor. A laundress might be asked to burn fine clothing that did not belong to the household. Yet the stratified nature of medieval society ensured that questions remained unspoken. It was not just that Gilles was a noble, it was that he was that noble. A man who had ridden beside Joan of Arc, a man whose name still commanded awe. In such a world, accountability was not a right, it was a weapon, and few dared lift it. Even local clergy, who occasionally visited Gilles's holdings, seemed hesitant to dig too deeply. They were shown chapels lined with gold, libraries of illuminated manuscripts, and feasts that honored the saints. They were treated as honored guests and sent away with gifts. The illusion of piety remained intact, supported by spectacle and enforced by silence. And so the disappearances continued, hidden in plain sight. If the murders had begun with shadows, then by this phase they had become a system. The crimes were no longer haphazard, no longer solitary. They were sustained by a structure Gilles built deliberately, brick by brick, in both his physical estate and the human machinery that served it. The scale of what he perpetrated could not have been maintained by one man alone. And it wasn't. He surrounded himself with a carefully chosen cabalman who did not merely assist, but enabled and enforced his depravity, shielding him from exposure through a mixture of loyalty, greed, and fear. To understand how the atrocities were committed so frequently and with such impunity, one must descend into this protected inner sanctum, where moral gravity ceased to function and the boundaries of horror were not just crossed, but systematized. It began, like many of Gilles's turns, with a man of learning, or, at least, a man of mystery. Francesco Prelati, a Tuscan cleric who claimed to possess forbidden knowledge of necromancy, arrived in Gilles's orbit as a symbol of possibility. Prelati promised contact with demons. He offered rituals that could summon infernal spirits capable of delivering wealth, power, and arcane secrets. At a time when Gilles's fortunes were dwindling and his psyche already teetered from fantasy into delusion, this offer was irresistible. But Prelati was not merely a deluded scholar or a charlatan. He was, by most accounts, a manipulator who recognized in Gilles a man willing to believe anything if it justified his actions. The dark rites Prelati offered invocations written in blood, sacrifices offered under moonlight, oaths whispered to demons with elaborate names, gave Gilles something his conscience may have still vaguely needed: a framework of absolution. Cloaked in the language of destiny, Gil came to believe, or pretended to believe, that the murders were not senseless. They were components of ritual, steps in a larger metaphysical process. It is here, amid candlelit altars and invocations, in bastardized Latin, that the crimes took on the veneer of sacrament. Testimonies from later trials describe ceremonies where Gilles and his accomplices gathered in underground chambers, surrounded by symbols and drawn sigils, invoking Lucifer or Baron whatever demon suited the occasion. Sometimes Gilles demanded a child's death be part of the offering. Sometimes he asked for the child to scream, claiming the sound lent power to the summoning. Whether he believed in these rituals or only used them to mask sadism behind a spiritual delusion is, in the end, almost irrelevant. The effect was the same: a new layer of justification wrapped around the old horrors. But not all of Gillis's enablers came cloaked in occult trappings. Roger de Brickville and Etienne Correlot, better known as Henriette, had no pretensions toward sorcery. They were men of practical talent, soldiers once, then stewards and fixers. Henriette, in particular, was considered a trusted companion, someone who had served under Gilles in more honorable times. That transition from loyal soldier to silent accomplice illustrates the incremental corrosion that occurred within the chateau walls. These men were not simply frightened into silence. They participated. They arranged logistics, disposed of corpses, and sometimes even helped procure the children under false pretenses. They were not captives of circumstance. They were collaborators. Jean de Sille, another of Gilles's key aides, was perhaps the most brazen. He was not only complicit in the acts, but reportedly involved in scouting suitable children from nearby towns and villages. His position, higher in rank and closer to the nobility, made him an ideal go-between. Sille could speak the language of courtly diplomacy while arranging grotesque lures in the background. To the families of the children, the offer often appeared: miraculous education at the hands of a nobleman, employment in a fine house, sometimes even food or clothing for their other children. The trap was always disguised as charity. Once taken behind the gates of Tiffages or Champtus, the children rarely emerged. Those who worked directly under Gilles, servants, pages, stable boys, found themselves caught in a suffocating web. The atmosphere was thick with fear. Whispers of disappearances circulated, but open defiance was impossible. Some servants reported being forced to clean rooms where blood had pooled under flagstones. Others testified to the scent of burning flesh, masked by incense and tar. Bribery and threats ensured that rumors never crossed the estate's boundary. Anyone who suspected too much was either dismissed or absorbed into the silence. Gilles had effectively created an insulated world, a miniature kingdom where his word was absolute and his cruelties could unfold unchecked. Key to maintaining this world was ritual, not only occult rites, but repetition. There was a choreography too. The crimes when to lure, when to isolate, when to dispose. The same rooms were used again and again. The same lies were repeated to parents. The same acts were committed, growing in complexity and cruelty as Giles sought ever more elaborate methods of gratification. What had once perhaps been improvisational, even hesitant, calcified into routine. The pageants he once orchestrated on stage had migrated into the chambers of his estates, now staged for an audience of one. And yet, what held this grotesque theatre together was not only logistics or secrecy, it was belief. Gil wrapped his crimes in layers of self-justifying ideology. He began to claim that what he did was part of a pact forged in the shadow between heaven and hell. Some accounts suggest he believed the devil required suffering to grant him fortune. Others say he believed the children's spirits would serve him in the afterlife. Even these contradictory claims suggest a man no longer tethered to reality, but desperately seeking a narrative that allowed him to continue. The occult became less a means to power than a scaffolding for denial. In his own writings, scarce as they are, Gil referenced transmutation, a word with dual meaning in the alchemical world. It referred to changing base metals into gold, but also the transformation of self, of becoming more than human. Whether metaphor or delusion, Gil seemed to believe that his rituals and murders were reshaping him into something transcendent, a figure of power beyond the judgment of men. This was no longer just sadism, it was metamorphosis pursued through flesh and fire. The men who enabled him also changed. Prelati became more flamboyant in his ritualism, often writing elaborate spell books and claiming to communicate with infernal messengers. Sil grew bolder in his deceptions, exploiting his status to deflect suspicion. Henriette, whose confessions later would be among the most detailed, showed signs of inner torment, but never enough to refuse a command. They became avatars of Gillis's will, shaped by proximity to his madness. Some may have started with fear, others with greed, but by this point, their identities had fused with their roles. What Gil had constructed was not only a hidden operation, but a cult in the truest sense. He was the spiritual center, the high priest and executioner, surrounded by a priesthood of frightened, corrupted men. They chanted his myths, obeyed his edicts, and shielded his desecrations from the light. Testimony from the eventual trials suggested the men participated in mock masses where Gilles played God. The children were sacrifices, and Prelati acted as infernal priest. These rituals served a dual function. They were both sacred theater and psychological tether, binding the participants to one another through shared guilt and illusion. No one could speak without implicating all. Silence was survival. Even the architecture of Gils's castles reflected this descent into horror. Hidden chambers were built, trapdoors installed. One room in particular was later described by witnesses as having hooks embedded in stone walls, tables with grooves for draining blood, and piles of discarded clothing in one corner. While these descriptions may have been amplified by the church's need to horrify the public during his trial, the consistency of detail across unrelated testimonies lends them grim credibility. These were not crimes of passion, they were crimes of industry. And as the years passed, the secrecy grew denser. Gils's estates became haunted in local rumor, not for ghosts, but for vanishing children. The brave avoided his path. Parents warned one another in whispers. But the nobility still treated him as a man of rank, and his wealth diminished, though it was still purchased silence. The church, wary of targeting a former marshal of France, hesitated, and so the cult endured, feeding on the most vulnerable. Protected by the fear and deference his name still commanded, eventually it would unravel, but not yet. The boy had been no older than 12. That much the testimony agrees on. Whether he had come from a village farther north or had been pulled from the alleys near Champtus was never made entirely clear. What matters what the court would record, what the servants whispered, what the executioners later recited with dry mouths and lowered eyes, was that he had entered the chateau, was taken into the great hall for an audience, and was never seen again. This disappearance, like so many others, would not be immediate cause for panic. Poor families often had children disappeared, indentured, starved, run away, dead. And when a nobleman of wealth and mystique called for boys to serve in his household, promising food and education, who was a peasant to question it? In the chambers above, however, a different world operated. Draped in the heavy velvet of ritual and thick with the scent of perfumed oils masking blood, these rooms were not merely spaces of privacy, they were theaters of control, designed as much for performance as for sadism. Witnesses would later describe the layout in chilling detail. The lavish bed hung with silk curtains, the iron implements tucked behind tapestry folds, the hidden passageways leading to chambers no servant was allowed to enter uninvited. The furnishings were rich, even decadent, and seemed to mock the horrors committed within. Henriette, one of Gilles's most loyal retainers and later a key witness, told the court of nights when Gilles would bring a boy into the chamber with laughter on his lips. The child would be offered wine or sugared fruits. Sometimes music would play, minstrels ordered to perform below the window to create a mood. What began with flattery and gentleness could turn with a sharp snap of mood change, a flash of anger, or merely the signal that the time for indulgence had passed. The rituals of fear began then. Henriette described how Gilles would at times disrobe the child himself, speaking softly, calling the boy angel or treasure, before turning to the darker desires that festered beneath his charm. Other times he delegated this task to his accomplices, instructing them with theatrical precision, as though directing a grotesque play. The sexual violence, while central to the testimonies, was rarely described in full. Even the inquisitors grew hesitant, and many of the original depositions have euphemisms, phrases like dishonor, unnatural usage, or outrage against innocence, which veiled the full horror. But enough remains to understand the pattern. The acts rarely ended quickly. Torture followed. Gilles's fascination with pain and death was not impulsive, but methodical. The boys were often bound, stripped naked, and subjected to prolonged torment. Henriette described instruments whose names he did not know: metal tools, sharpened rods, clamps. Prelotti, the defrocked cleric and alchemist in Gilles's circle, would later imply that some of these devices had symbolic significance, part of rituals meant to summon demonic forces or channel dark power. Whether this was sincere belief or posturing remains uncertain. What is clear is that the acts escalated, and that for Gilles cruelty had become a sacrament. Some boys were strangled, others were decapitated, some were disemboweled, their bodies mutilated in ways that suggest a mingling of sadism and sacrificial fantasy. On more than one occasion, Gilles reportedly knelt beside the dying child and watched the light go out in their eyes. This moment, the extinguishing of life, seems to have held a particular fascination for him. Witnesses claimed that he spoke of it as beautiful as the ultimate possession, as though by ending the life he had consumed its essence. When death came, it did not end the violation. Gilles often defiled the corpses, and the disposal was no less ritualized. According to trial testimony, the bodies were burned in the fireplace or buried in secret pits within the castle grounds. Servants tasked with cleaning would sometimes find remnants, bone shards, blood-soaked linens, the smell of scorched flesh that lingered long after the flames had died. Gilles demanded absolute silence. Henriette said he learned early to avert his eyes, to perform his duties with mechanical obedience. He knew what defiance meant. He had seen it punished. Sometimes Gilles would invite guests to witness the spectacle, not openly, but through suggestion, through implication. There is record of at least one nobleman, unnamed in the proceedings, who may have attended a chamber performance, cloaked under the guise of alchemical curiosity. In these rare moments, Giller blended his aristocratic persona with the monstrous one, wrapping cruelty in the robes of philosophy, power, and theatrical grandeur. But the most harrowing testimonies did not come from Gilles's inner circle. They came from surviving family members of the missing children, some of whom were later permitted to speak during the trial. One woman, a mother from Machical, described how her son had been promised a place in the chapel choir. She had seen the golden carriage arrive and the fine man within offer bread and coins. She had watched her son leave with hope on his face. She never saw him again. Another father, a miller, told of searching for weeks and finding nothing but whispers. Other boys taken, other families grieving in silence. Afraid to accuse a man too powerful to touch. It was not only Gilles's brutality that disturbed the court, it was his apparent joy in it. He did not commit these acts out of madness in the traditional sense. He planned them, cherished them, even catalogued them in his mind. One servant testified that Gilles kept objects from the Boyce's scrap of fabric, a curl of hair, a name etched into wood. They were trophies, reminders of what he had consumed. And yet, in the broader world, Gilles maintained his noble facade. Visitors to his estate would see the pageantry, the ornate feasts, the halls filled with music. He donated to churches, commissioned paintings, and still spoke, on occasion, of Joan of Arc with reverence. The contradiction is stark. It is as though Giller de Race lived in two realms at once, one of gilded legacy and public virtue, and another of shadows, screams, and absolute dominion. This duality was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of his crimes. The ease with which he switched masks, the fluidity with which he moved between elegance and depravity, unnerved even hardened inquisitors. He could quote scripture and within minutes slit a boy's throat. He could pray in Latin, then mock God, as he desecrated a body. Gilles was not merely a predator. He was a man who had made horror into theatre, pain into a ritual, and innocence into fuel. By the time his castle walls finally gave up their secrets, the number of victims had grown, impossible to count. Historians estimate over 100 children were killed, though some suggest the true number may have been far higher. The testimonies do not always agree on exact dates or numbers. The records are fragmented, some damaged by time, others, likely, censored even by those who recorded them. But the pattern is undeniable. From the early disappearances to the fully choreographed murders, Giller de Race had refined his system into something near mechanical, and at the heart of it all was the chamber lavishly furnished, thick with velvet and wrought where children went in, and no one came out. The walls of Giller de Race's estates were high, not only of stone and mortar, but of silence. For years, cries vanished into corridors no one dared to enter, and questions were swallowed by the weight of titles, alliances, and ecclesiastical protections. What Gilles constructed was not merely a chamber of horrors. It was a system of impunity shielded by gold bloodlines, and a web of influence that stretched into the very institutions charged with safeguarding the innocent. That he could commit such atrocities for so long without meaningful interference begs the question not of what he did, but of why no one stopped him by the mid-1430s. The name Gilles de Race still carried the echo of battlefield glory to many. In the nobility, he was not a man fallen from grace, but a man too illustrious to fall at all. His wealth, already immense by inheritance, had flowed outward in a way that served to both dazzle and disarm. Landowners, knights, merchants, abbots many had tasted his generosity. Even as his fortune dwindled from theatrical excesses and occult experiments, the image of power remained intact, propped up by the illusion of control and the strategic disbursement of gifts, titles, and influence. Gil understood instinctively what modern predators like. Epstein would later weaponize that the currency of silence is favor, and that the higher one's status, the more immunity is assumed. The church should have been a firewall, but in practice, it functioned more like a sieve, letting corruption pass through as long as the correct rites were observed and the right palms greased. Selling indulgences, remissions of sin exchanged for monetary donation, had become a grotesque caricature of the doctrine it was meant to embody. In this spiritual economy, even rumors of satanic rituals and child disappearances could be absolved, provided the right price was paid. Giller, steeped in both piety and perversity, played the part of the penitent noble when needed. He gave to religious institutions, funded masses, and cultivated a visible air of devotion that made accusations appear not just scandalous, but absurd. After all, what priest would speak against a man who funded his altar? Even more pernicious was the fear that radiated from his entourage into the surrounding communities. Local peasants, whose children were vanishing one by one, lacked the means and, more importantly, the belief that they could bring charges against someone of such stature. Some whispered, others wept, but few acted. And when they did, they often found their pleas falling into voids. Bailiffs turned them away. Priests urged silence and prayers. Officials reminded them, not always kindly, of who de Race was. The social gap between predator and prey was more than economic, it was cosmic. In the feudal hierarchy, Guile stood as a quasi-divine figure, and confronting him would be tantamount to accusing a prince of murdering ants. When complaints reached higher circles, they were often intercepted. Jean de Malestroit, Bishop of Nantes, is said to have received multiple accounts of unnatural behavior taking place at Gilles's castles. Rather than escalate these rumors, he reportedly delayed or deflected, citing lack of evidence or jurisdiction. Whether out of fear, complicity, or self-preservation, many like him hesitated to move against a nobleman who had once stood arm in arm with the saviors of France. The bishop had little appetite for scandal, and perhaps less courage to pursue it. Complicity took many forms. Pierre de la Hapitel, the president of the Parliament of Brittany, had personal ties to some of Gilles's family lands. Several secular authorities were effectively in his debt, either politically or financially. Testimonies gathered later at trial hint at early warnings ignored or redirected. A traveling priest, a steward's apprentice, a village widow, these voices appear in depositions, describing how they had once tried to raise concern and were rebuffed. These accounts were not so much lost as they were erased, intentionally obscured beneath the weight of bureaucratic inertia and elite indifference. There's something unsettlingly modern in the way the system closed ranks. Guile had built a myth around himself, and that myth served him better than any legal counsel. He had become a figure too large, too ornate, too soaked in noble privilege for people to imagine he could be guilty of something as base and monstrous as child murder. He hosted pageants, employed musicians, funded churches, and paid scribes to record his deeds in epic verse. The grotesque reality of his crimes was obscured not only by fear, but by disbelief. When someone of such prestige commits evil, it becomes easier for society to doubt the accuser than to believe the accusation. And then there were the accomplices. His inner circle, Henriette Sill, Prelotti, formed a core of functionaries who carried out his instructions, but many more hovered on the periphery. Stable hands, cooks, guards, valets, some of them knew fragments, others knew everything. They said nothing, sometimes out of loyalty, sometimes because they too had tasted blood. Others still were bought into silence, their futures insured with coin or title. Guile didn't just build secret chambers, he built a miniature state of terror and dependency, and those within it learned quickly that to speak was to disappear. What makes this protection especially chilling is how it mirrors modern enablers of powerful abusers. Like Epstein, Gillis surrounded himself with layers of insulation. He was rarely alone with a victim until everything had already been arranged. The child selected, the path cleared, the witnesses silenced or made complicit. Just as Epstein had private islands and jets to contain his operations, Guild had towers, moats, and halls where screams vanished into stone. Just as Epstein relied on a network of socialites, secretaries, and fixers, Giller depended on his network of retainers and clerics, each performing small tasks in a larger machine of evil. The church, for its part, only acted when it could no longer avoid doing so. By the time the ecclesiastical inquiry was convened in 1440, dozens, perhaps hundreds of children were already dead. The trigger wasn't moral outrage, but political necessity. Guild had kidnapped a cleric during a dispute with a church institution over property. This rash act, not the screams of peasant mothers, not the mounting disappearances, was what forced the bishop's hand. The church needed to assert its authority, and suddenly Guile was no longer a benefactor, but a liability. Even then, the proceedings were cautious. The church moved slowly, not wanting to rattle the nobility or spark backlash from the powerful race family. Interrogations were selective. Witnesses were vetted. It took secular intervention, particularly from the Duke of Brittany, to finally corner Shield into legal exposure. And even then, the line between sacred and secular was thin. The Duke's motivations were likely as much political as moral, curbing Gilles's power, reclaiming his lands, signaling to other nobles that there were boundaries even blood could not cross. Throughout, the inertia of privilege had done its work. The system, built to reflect and reinforce power, had shielded him far beyond reason. And just like Epstein decades later, Guild managed to craft a world in which he was untouchable until his crimes became too public to ignore. The comparison isn't poetic, it's structural. Two men, separated by centuries, exploiting the same levers: status, wealth, favors, and silence. That silence wasn't merely personal. It was institutional. Courts failed. Clergy looked away. Peers refused to believe or chose not to care. For every child dragged screaming into the dark, there was someone in power who heard but did nothing. It is in this failure, not merely the horror of the crimes, but the quiet acquiescence surrounding them, that the legacy of Gilead race most starkly mirrors that of the predators who would come long after. The danger wasn't only behind the chamber doors. It was in every official who preferred comfort over confrontation, every priest who prayed instead of intervening, every noble who averted his eyes. The cruelty of what followed cannot be understood without acknowledging the scaffolding that allowed it. Giller did not rise in darkness. He flourished in broad daylight, within castles funded by church blessings and aristocratic indulgence. His descent into depravity was not a secret collapse, it was a well-guarded performance that the world around him watched, half aware and wholly unwilling to interfere. For years, Gilderoy's life was a delicate performance, an elaborate dance of power, violence, and secrecy that seemed to shield him from consequence. His estates gleamed with pageantry, and his public image remained intact, even as whispers of horrors circulated in hushed tones. Yet, no mask can hold forever. Underneath the glittering surface, the cracks began to deepen, splintering the carefully constructed facade and setting the stage for a collapse that would be as brutal as the acts it concealed. At the heart of this unraveling was Gilles's increasing financial desperation. His fortune, once vast and secure, had been steadily depleted by years of sponsoring grandiose theatrical productions, procuring expensive artifacts for his occult pursuits, and sustaining his network of enablers. Land taxes, debts to merchants, and the costs of maintaining multiple estates stretched his resources thin. More than once, chroniclers noted the Baron's visible anxiety over money, a shift from the confidence of his youth to the fraught behavior of a man cornered by circumstance. The financial strain pushed Gillett toward increasingly reckless actions. He tried to pawn family lands and titles, hoping to stem the tide of debt, but the market for noble properties was limited, and the prestige of his name no longer guaranteed easy sales. In this climate of scarcity, every coin counterdowned, so did every opportunity to replenish the coffers by any means necessary. The children who vanished from his estates were no longer just victims of cruelty. They were commodities in a deeper calculus. The network of recruitment intensified, with new methods employed to lure more victims into his grasp. This desperation manifested not only in money, but in mood. Accounts from those close to Gillett in his final years describe a man increasingly volatile and erratic. His fits of anger became unpredictable. His generosity turned to cruelty in moments without warning. Former confidants recalled moments when Gillett would rant about enemies, conspiracies, and betrayals with a wild fire in his eyes. This instability unnerved even those who had once been loyal without question. The delicate balance of fear and favor began to tip, and cracks in his protective circle emerged. One of the critical turning points in this downward SBY was a violent dispute with a local cleric over the ownership of lands and rights near one of Gilles's estates. The cleric, emboldened perhaps by the whispers of Gilles's misconduct and frustrated by encroachments on church property, confronted the Baron directly. What began as a legal disagreement swiftly escalated into open hostility, with Gilles reportedly threatening violence and the cleric responding with appeals to ecclesiastical authority. This clash was more than a mere quarrel over land. It exposed the tension between Gilles's fading power and the institutional structures that had long tolerated him. The Church, which had previously turned a blind eye, found itself compelled to intervene not because of the rumors of child murders, but because Gillett had crossed a threshold of political defiance. By threatening a cleric, Gillett had forced the hand of church authorities, transforming private suspicions into public concern. The dispute unleashed a series of investigations, initially cautious and circumspect. Church officials sought to avoid scandal, but were pressed by persistent complaints from villagers and lower clergy who refused to remain silent. As inquiries deepened, more testimonies emerged, many corroborating the existence of dark rituals and the disappearance of children. The tension that Gillett had so carefully managed began to unravel in a flood of accusations. Crucially, this growing scrutiny collided with Gilles's faltering ability to maintain his usual system of bribery and intimidation. Key officials, willing to accept gifts or favors in exchange for silence, started to demand larger sums, sensing the risks involved. Some refused altogether, their patience exhausted or their consciences stirred. Gilles's attempts to silence them with threats were no longer as effective. His authority diminished by his erratic behavior and mounting debts, with fewer allies willing to cover for him. Gilles's secrets became harder to bury. Rumors that had long hovered at the edges of noble society now moved into open discourse. Letters of complaint found their way to higher courts, and political rivals seized the opportunity to weaken a once formidable figure. The interplay of financial ruin, political ambition, and moral outrage created a perfect storm. The final breach came when Guild was arrested in 1440, following a coordinated effort by secular and ecclesiastical authorities. His capture was both dramatic and symbolic, the fall of a man who had long appeared untouchable. The charges were grave: heresy, sodomy, witchcraft, and the murder of numerous children. The trial that followed laid bare the depth of his depravity and shattered the illusions of his nobility throughout the proceedings. Gilles's attempts to defend himself ranged from denial to confession, often contradictory and desperate. His noble birth could no longer shield him from judgment. The facade that had protected his crimes was irrevocably broken. What remained was the cold light of truth, illuminating the horrors concealed within the walls he had built. The fall of Gilded race offers a stark study in how privilege and power can delay justice, but only to a point. His financial desperation and increasingly reckless behavior eroded the protections that had once seemed impenetrable. When he challenged the church directly, he forced a confrontation that would bring decades of silence crashing down, and in that moment, the carefully maintained illusion of invincibility crumbled, revealing the monstrous reality beneath. The arrest of Gilded race in 1440 was not merely the capture of a disgraced nobleman. It was the beginning of an ordeal that would expose the darkest recesses of human depravity to the unforgiving light of medieval justice. For years, the crimes had been whispered behind closed doors, dismissed as rumors or the wild imaginings of frightened peasants. But now, in the austere chambers of the church and the courts, these horrors would be documented with painstaking detail, forcing even the most hardened inquisitors to confront a nightmare beyond their experience. The circumstances of Gilles's arrest were steeped in tension and contradiction. While his violent dispute with a local cleric had provided the pretext for intervention, the broader context was far more complex. Political forces aligned against Gilla saw an opportunity to bring down a once powerful rival, while ecclesiastical authorities, pressured by accumulating evidence and public unease, sought to assert their authority. The arrest was swift and public. No longer could Gilla rely on the silence his wealth and status had purchased. Once in custody, Gilla was subjected to rigorous interrogation. The church, wary of his noble lineage and the political ramifications, initially approached the proceedings with caution. However, as witness after witness testified to the unimaginable crimes committed within his estates, the veneer of caution peeled away to reveal a zealous determination to uncover the full extent of his guilt. These testimonies, drawn from servants, peasants, clergy, and even some of Gilles's own associates, painted a portrait of systematic abuse, ritualized murder, and blasphemous practices. Court transcripts revealed that Gilles's own confessions vacillated between denial, minimization, and chilling admissions. At times, he appeared to grasp the gravity of his actions, offering remorse tinged with despair. On other occasions, he seemed detached, almost proud, recounting his deeds with a disturbing calmness that shocked the inquisitors. The contradictions in his statements suggested a mind fractured by guilt, delusion, and the desperate desire to control his narrative even in the face of overwhelming evidence. One of the most striking aspects of the trial was the reaction of those present. The inquisitors, experienced in interrogating heretics and criminals, found themselves unprepared for the scale and nature of Giles's depravity. Eyewitness accounts describe moments of visible horror and disbelief as testimonies detailed acts of sexual violence, sadistic torture, and ritual sacrifice involving children. The sheer volume and consistency of the accusations left little room for doubt. The trial transcripts also expose the mechanics of medieval justice. While the Church sought to deliver accountability, the proceedings were deeply entangled with political considerations. Giles's noble birth demanded a degree of procedural care, and the court was careful to balance the need for confession with the risk of scandalizing the nobility. The interrogation was punctuated by threats of torture, offers of clemency in exchange for truth, and appeals to religious authority. Despite these complexities, the trial represented a rare moment when institutional power acted decisively against a figure of high status. The collaboration between secular and ecclesiastical courts underscored the seriousness with which Giles's crimes were treated. His eventual confession sealed his fate, transforming him from a mythic figure of nobility and military valor into a condemned criminal whose actions had shattered the moral fabric of his time. Throughout the trial, detailed descriptions of the crimes emerged. Witnesses recounted how zeal had lured children with promises of education, food, or work, only to subject them to unspeakable horrors in his private chambers. The testimonies did not shy away from the gruesome details, methods of torture, the blasphemous rituals conducted under prelati's guidance, and the systematic nature of the murders. This openness was unusual for the period and attributed to the trial's notoriety. Giles's psychological state during the proceedings was a subject of scrutiny. Some contemporaries suggested that his confession was coerced by fear of eternal damnation or the threat of torture. Others believed that Giles was genuinely remorseful, tormented by the realization of his sins. The records show moments where Giles wept, pleaded for forgiveness, and expressed a desire for spiritual redemption. Whether these were acts of contrition or performances calculated to soften judgment remains debated. The political dimension of the trial cannot be overstated. Gilles de Rais was not merely a criminal. He was a symbol of a waning feudal order struggling to maintain control amidst shifting power dynamics. His downfall served as a warning to other nobles who might flout ecclesiastical authority or engage in excesses unchecked. The Church, eager to demonstrate its role as moral arbiter, leveraged the trial to reinforce its influence over secular lords. At the conclusion of the trial, Giles was found guilty on all counts. The verdict was both a legal judgment and a moral reckoning, condemning him to death by hanging and burning, a fate reserved for the most heinous offenders. The sentence was carried out publicly, intended to serve as both punishment and deterrent. The legacy of the trial extended beyond Giles's execution. It set a precedent for accountability among the nobility, challenging the notion that birthright could place one above the law. Moreover, it exposed the vulnerabilities of medieval institutions when faced with internal corruption and abuse. The detailed records preserved from the trial offer historians invaluable insight into the period's legal practices, social hierarchies, and the intersection of power and violence. In many ways, the trial of Gilles de Rais marked a turning point in medieval justice. It revealed the limits of noble immunity and the capacity of church and secular authorities to collaborate in pursuit of truth, however flawed that pursuit might have been. The case remains one of the most infamous in history, a grim testament to human cruelty and the complex interplay of power, fear, and justice. The final act in the tragic saga of Gilles Race unfolded within the austere walls of the church and the shadowed confines of the prison where he awaited judgment. After a trial that laid bare the full scale of his crimes, Gilles was compelled to confess not only to the brutal murders of dozens of children, but also to the dark rituals and blasphemous acts that had accompanied them. His confession was both the key to his fate and a window into the tortured psyche of a man caught between genuine repentance and calculated self-preservation. The transcripts of his confession paint a complex portrait. Gilles admitted to his guilt, in vivid detail, recounting the methods by which he lured children into his grasp, the agonies inflicted upon them, and the ceremonies he believed were necessary to secure supernatural power. Yet, even as he spoke, there lingered a question among his judges and later historians. Was his contrition sincere? Or was it a strategic move aimed at easing the severity of his punishment or ensuring his soul's salvation? Some passages from the confession suggest genuine remorse. Gilles invoked the mercy of God repeatedly, lamented his sins, and expressed a desire for absolution. He spoke of nights tormented by nightmares, of the faces of his victims haunting his sleep. These emotional outpourings may reflect the awakening conscience of a man confronted with the immensity of his transgressions. Alternatively, they may have been performances designed to elicit leniency, to fit the model of the penitent sinner required by the Church. In medieval theology, confession was more than admission. It was a sacrament that could open the gates of forgiveness. For Gilles, the act of confessing was both a spiritual necessity and a legal requirement. It marked a final acknowledgement of guilt, the tipping point at which denial gave way to acceptance, whether the feelings behind the words were genuine or feigned. They served to shape the narrative of his downfall and framed his legacy in terms of repentance. Following his confession, Gilles faced the grim reality of his sentence: death by hanging, followed by burning. This method was reserved for those convicted of heresy and crimes deemed especially vile. The execution was scheduled to be public, a spectacle designed not only to punish, but to warn others of the consequences of such depravity. On the day of the execution, a large crowd gathered in the town square of Nantes, drawn by a mixture of fear, curiosity, and the human fascination with spectacle. Contemporary chroniclers describe a scene heavy with emotion. Some in the crowd reportedly wept openly, mourning the innocent lives lost and the fall of a once great noble. Others watched in silent horror, unable to reconcile the man who had fought alongside Joan of Arc with the monster condemned before them. There was also an undercurrent of sympathy, strange as it might seem. In a society that valued penitence, the image of a man confessing his sins and accepting death could evoke a degree of compassion. Gilles's noble birth and military service complicated public perception. To some, he remained a tragic figure, a fallen hero undone by his own demons. To others, he was a symbol of the rot beneath feudal grandeur. The execution itself was carried out with grim efficiency. Gilles was led to the gallows, his posture reportedly resigned rather than defiant. The hanging was swift. The crowd held its breath as the noose was placed. Following the execution, his body was consigned to the flames, a final purification ritual meant to cleanse the sins that stained his soul and prevent the veneration of his corpse. Despite the severity of his crimes, the Church granted Gil a degree of posthumous dignity that surprised many. His remains were buried in consecrated ground, a concession reflecting the Church's belief in redemption and the power of confession. This burial within holy soil contrasted starkly with the brutal nature of his crimes and the public spectacle of his death. It underscored the complex relationship between sin, punishment, and forgiveness that characterized medieval spirituality. The aftermath of Gilles's execution rippled through the communities affected by his actions. Survivors, families of victims, and witnesses grappled with the horror and trauma. The trial and execution provided a form of closure, a public reckoning that acknowledged their suffering and held the perpetrator accountable. Yet, the psychological scars remained, etched deeply into the collective memory. The broader society wrestled with the implications as well. Gilles de Race's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers lurking beneath noble privilege and the capacity for evil to thrive when unchecked by moral or legal constraints. His downfall highlighted the tensions between power and justice, faith and corruption. Interestingly, the fascination with Gilles did not end with his death. Over time, his story was retold and reinterpreted, becoming entwined with folklore and myth. The blend of horror, fascination, and reluctant sympathy that marked his execution continued to shape his legacy in literature, history, and popular imagination. In examining Gilles's confession and execution, we see the final unraveling of a life marked by violence and excess. Whether his repentance was true or strategic, it offered a moment of confrontation with the consequences of his deeds. His death served as both punishment and a grim symbol of the limits of power. The Church's willingness to grant burial despite his crimes reflects the era's complex interplay of sin, redemption, and societal order. Thus, the story of Gilles de Race's final days is not merely a record of punishment, but a profound reflection on the nature of justice, mercy, and the human capacity for darkness and, perhaps, for contrition. The story of Gilles de Race, for centuries enshrined in horror and condemnation, has not remained static. History, as much as it records facts, is also shaped by interpretation, bias, and cultural currents. In the 20th century, some voices emerged, seeking to challenge the long-held narrative that painted Gilles solely as a monstrous figure. These revisionist attempts, fueled by a mixture of historical skepticism, ideological motives, and fascination with the enigmatic, aimed to rehabilitate his reputation, suggesting that he had been the victim of conspiracies orchestrated by church officials or political adversaries eager to bring down a powerful noble. These modern efforts to recast Gilles's story often began with questioning the validity of the trial itself. Critics pointed to the political context of the 15th century, arguing that Gilles was a casualty of a power struggle between the nobility and the church, or between rival factions within the feudal system. They contended that his confession was extracted under duress, that testimonies were manipulated, and that evidence was fabricated to serve the interests of those seeking to seize his lands and wealth. Some even suggested that Gilles's association with occult practices had been exaggerated or misunderstood, framed as a convenient justification for eliminating a dangerous figure. At the heart of this revisionism lies a skepticism of medieval justice, which was indeed far from modern standards of fairness or due process. The era's reliance on confessions of fan, obtained under threat of torture, and the intertwining of religious and political power created fertile ground for miscarriages of justice. It is not unreasonable to scrutinize historical records, especially when considering the stakes involved in prosecuting a nobleman. However, critical examination must be balanced with an honest appraisal of the evidence, and here the case of Gilles Race remains particularly troubling. Extensive trial records written contemporaneously and preserved with unusual thoroughness provide a detailed account of Gilles's crimes. Unlike many medieval trials, this one included multiple witnesses, cross-examinations, and a breadth of corroborating testimonies that extend beyond the hearsay typical of the period. The graphic nature of the accusations, while shocking, were supported by consistent reports from a range of social strata, from peasants and servants to members of the clergy, making the notion of a complete fabrication difficult to sustain. Moreover, attempts to downplay Gilles's guilt often overlook the broader pattern of his behavior documented over decades, including his public withdrawal, financial ruin, and the well-established presence of his inner circle, all of which fit the profile of a man descending into madness and moral collapse. The convergence of evidence from varied sources strengthens the conclusion that his crimes were not merely allegations manufactured for political expediency. Nevertheless, the impulse to rehabilitate Gilles's image reveals much about modern society's engagement with history and myth. Figures like Guile become symbols, their stories reinterpreted to serve contemporary narratives. For some, portraying him as a misunderstood victim challenges the idea of absolute evil, raising questions about historical bias and the fallibility of justice systems. For others, it feeds into a broader skepticism toward institutional authority and the official versions of history. But such revisionism carries dangers, especially when it risks obscuring the suffering of actual victims and the reality of systemic abuse. Romanticizing or excusing Gilles Race undercuts the gravity of his crimes and the historical truth of the lives destroyed. It can serve to silence survivors, distort moral lessons, and provide cover for modern abuses of power. By suggesting that accusations against the powerful are always suspect or politically motivated, the mythology that surrounds Gilles also with the folk tale of Bluebeard, whose dark legend of a nobleman murdering wives in secret chambers blurs fact and fiction. While fascinating, this blending can fuel revisionist claims by suggesting the historical Guile was no more than a misunderstood character of folklore. Careful scholarship must distinguish between the chilling allure of legend and the documented reality of violence and cruelty. The ongoing debates over Gilles's legacy highlight the challenges historians face when dealing with figures who embody extremes of human behavior. To navigate between myth and fact requires a commitment to evidence, context, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. In the case of Gilles Race, the extensive documentation, including confessions and corroborated witness accounts, overwhelmingly supports the historical verdict of guilt. Despite attempts to rewrite his past, understanding these rehabilitation attempts also opens a window into the broader phenomenon of historical myth-making. Societies often reshape stories to reflect present concerns, sometimes downplaying inconvenient facts or emphasizing certain traits to serve ideological purposes. Gilles's story is a stark reminder that history is not immune to manipulation, and vigilance is necessary to preserve the integrity of the past. In this light, confronting the dark chapters of history, including the crimes of Gilles Race, is essential. Acknowledging systemic abuse, corruption, and failures of justice, not only in medieval times, but across eras, for a deeper understanding of the forces that enable such horrors. It also affirms the importance of giving voice to victims, and guarding against the allure of revisionism that minimizes or erases suffering. Ultimately, the efforts to rehabilitate Gilles's reputation, while reflecting genuine scholarly inquiry in some respects, fall short when weighed against the breadth and consistency of the historical record. They serve as a cautionary tale about the seductive power of myth and the ethical responsibility that comes with interpreting history. Gilles de Rais remains, above all, a symbol of unchecked evil, reminder of what can happen when power is divorced from accountability and justice. The history of human cruelty is marked by patterns that, despite centuries of change, persist in eerie resemblance. The story of Gilles de Rais, a medieval nobleman whose crimes horrified his contemporaries, finds unsettling echoes in the modern saga of Jeffrey Epstein. Though separated by nearly 6 centuries, the structural and psychological parallels between these two men reveal enduring dynamics of power, privilege, and predation that transcend time. By examining their methods, networks, and the social mechanisms that shielded them, we gain insight not only into individual monstrosity, but into the systemic failures that allow such figures to operate with impunity at the most visible level. Gilles de Rais and Jeffrey Epstein shared the ability to conceal unspeakable crimes beneath the guise of immense wealth and elite status. Gilles was a baron with vast lands, military honors, and noble lineage. Epstein was a financier with global connections, a web of influential friends, and resources that granted him access to the highest echelons of society. Their wealth was not simply a matter of luxury. It functioned as a protective armor, enabling them to deflect suspicion, silence critics, and manipulate those around them. One of the most striking parallels lies in their recruitment networks. Gilles exploited his estates and social standing to lure vulnerable children with promises of work, education, or sustenance, preying primarily on poor families who had little recourse. Epstein's operation similarly targeted minors, often from disadvantaged backgrounds, using a combination of grooming, manipulation, and coercion. Both men relied on a cadre of accomplices and enablers to facilitate the abductions and concealment of their crimes. Gilles's inner circle figures like Prelotti and Henriette performed roles, ranging from procuring victims to enforcing secrecy. Epstein surrounded himself with recruiters, bodyguards, and fixers who orchestrated a sophisticated system of exploitation. This network of enablers is central to understanding how such predators operate in plain sight. The machinery of silence, bribery, intimidation, social leverage functions as a buffer between the criminal acts and public awareness. Gilles paid off local officials, cultivated clerical allies, and fostered fear that prevented complaints from surfacing. Epstein used similar tactics, cultivating relationships with law enforcement, politicians, and celebrities who, whether knowingly or through negligence, allowed his abuses to continue unchecked. The ability to manipulate social structures and exploit human weaknesses proved decisive in prolonging their impunity. Both men also exploited the peculiarities of their respective justice systems. Gilles's trial and conviction came only after decades of unchecked crime and a direct challenge to church authority. Epstein's multiple arrests and legal settlements illustrate a modern pattern, where wealth and influence can delay or diminish accountability. Epstein's controversial plea deal in 2008, often criticized as excessively lenient, mirrors the medieval failures that enabled Gilles's abuses to persist. In both cases, societal deference to power and fear of scandal contributed to a justice system slow to act and reluctant to dismantle entrenched privilege. Beyond structural similarities, the psychological profiles of Gillo de Ras and Jeffrey Epstein revealed disturbing commonalities. Both men combined intellectual sophistication, strategic charm, and a sense of entitlement that fostered a belief in their own exceptionalism. Gill was not merely a brute. He was a learned man, educated and versed in occult philosophy, theatrical arts, and military tactics. Epstein cultivated a public persona of a philanthropist and intellectual, mingling with scientists, politicians, and celebrities. This intellectual veneer served to mask their darker impulses and lent an aura of legitimacy to their actions. More troubling is their self-righteousness, a kind of perverse ideology that justifies their predation. Giller believed in occult powers and rituals that he thought demanded sacrifice. Epstein seemed to operate with a cold, calculating awareness of his ability to control and corrupt. Both exhibited traits of narcissism, entitlement, and a lack of empathy that enabled them to rationalize horrific acts. Their charisma disarmed victims and bystanders alike, weaving a narrative in which they were misunderstood geniuses or victims of conspiracy. The cult of secrecy surrounding both men further reinforced their control. Gill's secret chambers, rituals, and the inner circle created a closed world where moral boundaries were erased. Epstein's private islands, jets, and gated mansions functioned similarly, isolating victims and shielding activities from public scrutiny. This physical and psychological isolation intensified the victims' vulnerability and complicated efforts to expose the truth. Another parallel is the way both men used their status to confuse or discredit accusers. Gill's noble birth and military service granted him a presumption of innocence in the eyes of many contemporaries, while Epstein's connections and wealth cast doubt on allegations, framing accusers as opportunists or liars. The social weight they carried served to silence dissent and fostered disbelief, enabling their crimes to continue longer than would otherwise be possible. Yet, in examining these parallels, it is essential not to conflate or reduce the unique contexts that shaped their actions. Medieval France was a feudal society with rigid hierarchies and an intertwined church-state power structure, while Epstein operated in a globalized, media-saturated world with complex legal frameworks and modern technology. Nonetheless, the underlying dynamics of power, abuse, systemic protection, and exploitation of vulnerability remain hauntingly consistent. The societal responses to their exposure also bear comparison. Gill's eventual arrest and trial were shaped by a mixture of political expediency and moral outrage, with authorities balancing justice against the risks of scandal. Epstein's case, similarly, sparked public outcry, but also exposed institutional failures and complicity at multiple levels. Both cases forced uncomfortable questions about who benefits from silence and the cost of complicity. These stories illuminate a dark human pattern, how charm and power can mask evil, how systems meant to protect can be corrupted, and how victims are often the last to be heard. They serve as warnings that the mechanisms enabling such predators, wealth shielding, social networks, institutional complacency persist, despite centuries of progress. In reflecting on Gilles de Rais and Jeffrey Epstein, we confront more than two individual monsters. We see the enduring vulnerabilities of societies that fail to check privilege, the dangers of mythologizing power, and the necessity of vigilance in protecting the vulnerable. Their legacies challenge us to dismantle the structures that allow abuse to flourish and to listen carefully to voices too long ignored. The horrific crimes of Gilded race did not emerge in a vacuum, but were deeply rooted in the cultural, social, and political fabric of feudal France. Understanding the environment that permitted such atrocities requires a broad examination of the structures that defined medieval life structures built on serfdom, rigid patriarchy, aristocratic privilege, and the pervasive desperation of the peasantry. Far from being a mere aberration, Gila was a product and symptom of a culture that normalized inequality and protected the expense of the vulnerable. At the expense of the vulnerable. At the core of this culture was serfdom, a system that bound peasants to the land and the will of their lords. These rural laborers had little autonomy, living under harsh economic conditions and subject to the whims of their aristocratic overlords. Their existence was marked by scarcity, hard labor, and limited legal rights. In this context, the peasants' inability to protect themselves from exploitation was not simply a consequence of individual weakness, but a structural reality. When children went missing near Giles's estates, families had scant resources, or recourse to seek justice, reinforcing their vulnerability. Patriarchal entitlement reinforced these inequalities. Medieval society was overwhelmingly male-dominated, with power concentrated in the hands of noblemen who wielded authority over land, law, and even the lives of those beneath them. The concept of honor and family lineage endowed nobles with near absolute control over their domains, including the people who lived and worked there. This power dynamic fostered an environment in which abuse could flourish unnoticed or unchallenged, as speaking out risked retaliation or social ostracism. Aristocratic immunity was another crucial factor enabling Giles's crimes. The nobility operated within a legal framework that often exempted them from ordinary accountability. Their status afforded privileges that placed them above common law, and offenses by nobles against lower classes were frequently overlooked or settled quietly. To avoid scandal, this immunity was bolstered by a network of alliances, patronage, and political influence that protected nobles from investigation or punishment unless their actions threatened wider order. Within this system, Giles's actions, though monstrous, were shielded by a culture that devalued the lives of the poor and prioritized the preservation of noble authority. The victims, mostly peasant children, occupied the lowest rungs of society. Their disappearances and suffering were less likely to provoke immediate outcry or rigorous inquiry. Moreover, the secrecy and terror imposed by Gilles and his accomplices ensured silence, while the broader societal indifference created a permissive atmosphere. The desperation of the peasantry compounded their vulnerability. Economic hardship made families susceptible to offers of work, food, or education, a common tactic used by Gilles to lure victims. This desperation was not accidental, but a consequence of systemic exploitation, taxation, and warfare that ravaged rural communities during the 100 Years' War. As survival became paramount, the ability to question or resist powerful figures diminished, deepening the cycle of abuse and silence. When considering this medieval context, it becomes clear that Gilded race was not an anomaly but a symptom of a culture that tolerated and concealed systemic abuses. The structures of feudalism, patriarchal dominance, and aristocratic privilege created conditions where predation was not only possible but in some respects expected to be overlooked. These historical realities find disturbing parallels in modern systems that enable sex trafficking and elite predators. Despite changes in laws, social attitudes, and technology, patterns of exploitation persist where power imbalances remain entrenched. Vulnerable populations often economically marginalized, continue to be preyed upon by individuals shielded by wealth, status, or political influence. The mechanisms of silence, bribery, intimidation, social stigma, though those of medieval times in many ways. The legacy of feudal culture survives in contemporary institutions and social dynamics that allow abuse to thrive. The persistence of patriarchal attitudes, disparities in wealth and justice, and the complicity or failure of authorities to intervene create modern environments not unlike those that protected Gilles de Race centuries ago. Recognizing this continuity is vital for dismantling the cultural and systemic factors that perpetuate exploitation. Understanding the culture that let Gilles's crimes happen thus serves as both a historical lesson and a call to vigilance. It reminds us that monstrous individuals do not act in isolation, but are often enabled by societies unwilling or unable to hold power to account. It challenges the notion that evil is purely personal, revealing how social structures and cultural norms can cultivate and conceal cruelty. The tragedy of Gilles de Race is a stark example of the costs of societal neglect and complicity. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the past and the present. It urges a critical examination of how power, privilege, and systemic inequality operate to protect predators and silence victims, whether in medieval castles or modern boardrooms. In drawing these conclusions, we acknowledge that preventing such horrors requires more than punishing individuals. It demands transforming the cultural and institutional frameworks that foster abuse. Only by addressing the root causes, the social conditions, legal protections, and cultural attitudes that enable predators can societies hope to break the cycle that claimed so many innocent lives in Gilles de Race's time and continues to do so today. The story of Gilles de Race lingers as a haunting testament to the depths of human cruelty and the dark potentials of power left unchecked. His life and crimes reveal more than the actions of a single individual. They expose the vulnerabilities and failures embedded in social systems, cultural attitudes, and institutions that can transform monstrous impulses into prolonged atrocities. Reflecting on Gilles's legacy forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about sadism, complicity, and the mechanisms by which societies permit horror to unfold. Often in plain sight, Gilles de Race embodies the convergence of privilege and pathology, a man whose wealth and noble status insulated him from early scrutiny and whose descent into sadism exploited systemic blind spots. His crimes were not spontaneous bursts of madness, but sustained, methodical, and horrifying acts nurtured within a culture that both enabled and concealed his depravity. This raises profound questions about the nature of evil. Is it solely an individual failing, or does it require a context that allows it to grow and persist? To view Gilles's story as a mere curiosity of medieval history risks missing the broader implications. His case illustrates how power can distort morality and corrode accountability. The social structures of feudal France patriarchy, aristocratic immunity, created fertile ground for exploitation. The intersection of political chaos during the 100 Years' War and the Church's ambivalent stance further weakened mechanisms of oversight. Within this environment, Gilles's actions could escalate with impunity, shielded by fear, silence, and social acceptance of hierarchical dominance. Sadism, as manifested in Gilles's crimes, is a grim symptom of deeper psychological and societal dysfunction. His alleged engagement with occult practices and ritual murder reveals how personal madness can intertwine with cultural mythologies to justify atrocity. But beyond the individual psychopathy lies a crucial lesson: cruelty thrives when isolated from moral constraints and unchallenged by communal vigilance. The terror inflicted upon victims was magnified by their helplessness in a system that valued their lives less. This pattern resonates beyond the medieval context. The parallels with Jeffrey Epstein, whose story unfolded centuries later yet echoed. Many of the same dynamics emphasize that the problem is not confined to a distant past. The protective shield of wealth and status, the manipulation of legal and social institutions, the use of networks to exploit and silence these elements, recur in varied forms across time and culture. Gilles's legacy warns that evil is not simply personal but systemic, nourished by structures that must be recognized and dismantled. Society's capacity for willful blindness is a key theme. In Gilles's time, deference to nobility and the church's authority contributed to ignoring warning signs and dismissing victims. In modern cases, similar patterns emerge in the form of disbelief toward accusers, victim blaming, and institutional inertia. This collective denial enables predators to operate for years, if not decades, before justice intervenes. Confronting this dynamic requires honesty about the social and psychological forces that perpetuate silence and complicity. Memory, not myth, must guide our understanding of Gillot des Races and similar figures. Over centuries, Gilles's story has morphed into legend, folklore, and sensationalized accounts that risk overshadowing historical truth. The Bluebeard myth, for example, distorts reality with its emphasis on mystery and horror, sometimes eliciting fascination that borders on glamorization. Preserving the facts, the detailed trial records, testimonies of survivors, and contemporary observations grounds the narrative in the experiences of those who suffered and the realities of systemic failure. This insistence on truth carries ethical weight. Remembering Gill accurately honors the victims and resists the temptation to reduce suffering to mere spectacle. It also provides a framework for analyzing power abuses in any era, highlighting the need for vigilance, transparency, and accountability. The story warns that unchecked privilege and societal neglect can produce horrors whose echoes resonate far beyond their time. Moreover, reflecting on Gilles de Race calls attention to the ongoing struggle against human cruelty. It challenges individuals and institutions alike to recognize the signs of exploitation, to resist complicity, and to foster cultures that protect the vulnerable. The medieval monster's tale becomes a mirror reflecting contemporary responsibilities. Reminder that the systems allowing evil to flourish can be dismantled through awareness, justice, and collective will. Ultimately, the story of Gillot des Races is not only a chronicle of monstrous acts, but a cautionary tale about the fragility of morality when confronted with power. It underscores the necessity of confronting uncomfortable truths about societal structures and human nature. His legacy demands that we hold firm to memory as a tool for justice, learning from history to prevent its darkest chapters from repeating.